The rivalry between the United States and Venezuela is one of the most volatile in the world. But what if the key to really understanding it lies in a playbook written decades ago in Panama? Let's break it down. Right now, the U.S. and Venezuela are, well, they're locked in this intense standoff. It's all about sanctions, clashing ideologies, and a real struggle for influence. It's easily one of the most tense relationships in the entire Western Hemisphere. So how on earth did it get this bad? And believe me, this isn't just some simple disagreement. We're talking about a conflict that's deeply rooted in the high-stakes world of oil politics. It's driven by absolutely crippling sanctions. It's fueled by this huge clash of ideologies. And really, at its core, it's a fundamental dispute over who's actually in charge. Okay, so to really get a handle on the present, we've got to rewind the clock. Because this rivalry, it wasn't always this way. It's the result of a really dramatic shift over the last few decades. It's kind of hard to imagine now, but before 1999, the U.S. and Venezuela were pretty stable partners. Venezuela was a top oil supplier to the States. That all changed with the election of Hugo Chavez, his revolution, then that failed coup against him in 2002, and all the crises that followed under Nicolas Maduro. Well, that's what turned a partnership into an open rivalry.
And the engine driving that whole transformation? It was this thing called the Bolivarian Revolution. This wasn't just a new guy in the president's office. It was a movement that fundamentally rewired Venezuela's politics, its economy, and its entire foreign policy. It basically positioned the country as a direct counterweight to U.S. influence in the region.
So with all that complexity, how do you even begin to unpack it? How do you make sense of all these pressures and potential fault lines? Well, funny enough, a lot of analysts look back to a really specific moment for answers: the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama. Now, let's be super clear here. This isn't about predicting a conflict. Not at all. It's about using Panama as a kind of framework to spot similar structural pressures. Things like a leader whose power is being questioned, a state that's starting to fracture from the inside, and a complete and total diplomatic breakdown. Just look at that first parallel. It's striking. In both cases, you have a leader whose basic claim to power is fiercely contested. Noriega just straight up annulled an election. Maduro's 2018 re-election was widely condemned as illegitimate. And that creates this fundamental crisis of legitimacy that becomes the central conflict. So let's zoom in on the operation itself. Operation Just Cause. We need to see how this thing actually went down on the ground. It was a really powerful, and I mean powerful, demonstration of rapid multi-branch force. The sheer scale of it was immense. The U.S. sent in nearly 30,000 personnel from all across its armed forces, and they executed this highly coordinated plan with just incredible speed. And it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about who was involved. This wasn't a single-branch show. It was a true joint campaign. You had elite units like Army Rangers and Navy SEALs, the 82nd Airborne, and even the F-117 stealth fighter making its combat debut. The whole shebang. The whole thing kicks off with these incredibly high-stakes surgical strikes. One of the very first and most critical missions was for the Navy SEALs, assault an airfield and destroy Manuel Noriega's private jet. They had to cut off his main escape route right from the start. And while that's happening, at pretty much the exact same time, you've got Army Rangers literally falling out of the sky. They conducted these daring nighttime parachute assaults to grab control of key airfields. The goal was to secure the gateways into the country, opening the door for thousands more troops to pour in. And then you get to one of the most bizarre tactics in modern military history. Seriously, when Noriega holed up in the Vatican's embassy, U.S. Psychological Operations Forces surrounded the place and just blasted loud rock music 24/7 to wear him down. It was a siege of sound. Okay, so with that picture of Panama in mind, we can start to see how analysts identify these structural similarities with Venezuela today. And remember, the goal isn't to predict the future, it's to understand the powerful dynamics that are in play. First up, there's that deep crisis of legitimacy we talked about. In both Panama and Venezuela, you have disputed elections that create a power vacuum, which then sparks these competing claims to leadership and divides the whole international community. And that leads directly into the second parallel. When a government's legitimacy is shaky, its own security forces start to fracture. Noriega faced coup attempts from inside his own ranks. In Venezuela, we've seen defections and serious factionalism between the military and these loyalist paramilitary groups. It's a classic sign that a regime is under severe stress.
And third, that fragmentation just opens the door for a whole bunch of other armed groups to pop up. Panama had his formal military, sure, but also para-police and loyalist cells. Venezuela's situation is even more complex. You've got the state military, pro-government militias called colectivos, Colombian guerrilla groups, even mining mafias, all operating inside the country.
Okay, so after all that, what's the point? What does looking back at Panama actually teach us about the standoff with Venezuela today? What are the real takeaways here? Well, the very first thing this comparison shows us is actually a huge, massive difference. See, Panama back in 1989 was relatively isolated. Today, Venezuela is a major player on a global geopolitical chessboard. It has powerful allies like Russia and China providing support. And that makes the situation profoundly more complex than what the U.S. faced in Panama. But, and this is the key, even with those big differences, the Panama case study is still an incredibly useful lens. It shows us how these internal fractures can completely define a crisis, how quickly diplomatic breakdowns can escalate, and how all these different pressures, political, military, informational, can crash into each other in a volatile urban environment. And really, this gets us back to the most important takeaway of all. This is not about predicting that history is going to repeat itself. It's about using the past to understand the patterns of fragility, the risks of escalation, and the dynamics of a crisis over who is truly in power.
So in the end, digging into this historical fault line, it isn't really about the past at all. It's about giving us a better, more structured way to analyze the powerful forces of politics, security, and international pressure that are shaping the Western Hemisphere right now, today. And that leaves us with a critical question to think about. As we watch all of this continue to unfold, how do the echoes of these old fault lines, these old playbooks, continue to shape the conflicts and the futures of today?